The South Australian Police is the oldest organised police force in Australia and one of the oldest in the world, created on the 28th of April 1838. 59 officers have their names recorded on the State Services Memorial at Centennial Park Cemetery, as having died on duty or as a result of incidents that occurred while on duty. The majority of these deaths have resulted from traffic accidents, while 8 of the men named were murdered. Then there were rarer causes of death. Here are 6 accounts of fallen officers. The first 2 members of the police to die on duty were Mounted Constable John Dunning Carter, aged 22, and Corporal William Murray Wickham, aged 24. Carter was a brother-in-law of Inspector Alexander Tolmer, later to become Commissioner, Tolmer having married Mary Carter in England in 1836. Carter and Wickham were stationed in the country at Murundi, near Blanchetown. On the 7th of May 1847, they were on their way to an area called Overland Corner to investigate reports of criminal activity. They needed to cross the Murray River about 6 miles from Lake Bonny. A local settler named Wigley, who had a hut on the far shore, paddled across the river in a bark canoe and picked up Carter. They made it safely to the other side, and then Carter went back to pick up Wickham. As the 2 young men were making the final crossing, Wigley heard a shout and a splash. It was dark, and Wigley could not see the men in the river. Wearing heavy police tunics, and in the dark water, the men were in peril immediately. The following day, Indigenous people found the bodies and recovered them. Both of them had drowned. They were buried near where they were found. Later in the same year, the bodies were disinterred and buried by members of the Mounted Police in a new grave, with a headstone paid for by donation, at West Terrace Cemetery, in Adelaide. In 1850, one method of removing undesirable elements from society was to ship them off somewhere else. South Australia transported some felons to Tasmania. Such was the fate of 9 prisoners. Thomas Francis Cooper, for forging and uttering an order for some money, was sentenced to 7 years transportation. William Clark, highway robbery with violence, who was originally sentenced to death but commuted to transportation. Isaac Carr, William Stewart, William Gibbons and John Smith, all for burglary. William Tyndall, larceny on the high seas, having stolen some furniture and other property from a Dr. Rule on a ship going from Gravesend to Plymouth in the UK in 1849. James Coyle, for returning from transportation before the end of his sentence, was sentenced to transportation for life. And Gottlieb Kierno, manslaughter. He had been charged with the axe murder of a man. One of the ships hired for transporting the prisoners was the Lady Denison. Built at the government dockyard at Port Arthur, Tasmania, by convict labour in 1847. It was named after the wife of the then Governor of Tasmania. The ship arrived in Port Adelaide from Hobart on the 10th of April 1850, under the command of Captain Hammond, with a cargo of fruits and vegetables, timber and vinegar. Sergeant Richard Ward and Mounted Constables William Freebody and Robert Hill were allocated the task of conveying the prisoners to Hobart in Tasmania. On the 17th of April 1850, the Governor of Adelaide Jail, with 4 mounted troops, escorted the prisoners to the ship. They were placed aboard at noon, and the ship towed down the harbour at 1 p.m. On board with the prisoner and escort were 12 crew and 17 paying passengers. The ship was carrying a mixed cargo which included pickles, hides and copper. By the 10th of May, rumours began circulating that the Lady Denison, being overdue, had sunk, but newspapers were remaining optimistic that the ship had not foundered. Ships had been blown well off course by gales before, and taken a long time to eventually limp into port. Theories that she may have been dismasted were viewed as possible, but the idea that the prisoners had rebelled and seized control of the ship were initially dismissed as outlandish. By the end of May, the idea that the convicts were sailing the bark to California was, however, becoming the popular explanation for the missing ship. By the 29th of May, fears for the ship were intensifying. The Marine Plant had sailed 2 weeks later and had already reached Launceston, on Tasmania's northern coast. The Marine Plant reported sailing through severe weather, the ship being damaged by the ferocity of the storms. A small ship named the Struggler, on its maiden voyage was wrecked on rocks, probably by the same storm in the same area. By mid-June, a report was received from a Mr. Bruce, a pilot stationed at Research Bay, who had seen a ship pass by on the 24th of April. The following day, a whaling ship, the Augustus, called into the bay, and Bruce asked the ship's master, William Young, what the name of the vessel he saw was. Young had answered, the Lady Denison. Finally, on the 1st of August, it was reported in the registered newspaper that Captain Duncan of the Lapwing had been informed by a sealer that he had seen wreckage strewn along the coast near Church Rock, at Cape Grim, on the west coast of Tasmania a month earlier. Part of the cabin, the poop ladder, skylight, several oars, articles of clothing and other debris had washed up on the shore. On a beach, bottom up, was a longboat marked the Lady Denison, which removed all doubt that the ship had gone down in a tempest. No reports of bodies or survivors was made, although a rumour arose that the sealers had found bodies and looted them of valuables. The South Australian Government officially accepted the men as lost, when new officers were appointed on the 6th of September 1850 to replace them. Several days later, the Bandicoot arrived in Hobart with the recovered stern of the longboat from Church Rock. No more was ever found from the wreck of the Lady Denison. The rumours persisted, however, that the convicts had managed to take control of the ship and escape. Had any of them made it to shore, they would have had an incentive to disappear. In December 1852, John Byatt, who had been transported under his alias of James Coyle, was reported to have been acquitted of a charge of murder on the Victorian goldfields. Said to have been recognised by a South Australian policeman who was there. If it was him, no official action was taken to find him. Coyle had worked in the area of Tasmania near where the wreck occurred, and if he had made it ashore, could have found help from friends. Another convict was said to have written a letter home from the Californian goldfields. Strangely, another tale had it that a female convict had been recognised in Victoria in 1853. This despite the fact that there were only 5 women who were paying passengers and no female prisoners aboard the Lady Denison. As late as the 1930s, the account of a mutiny on board the ship was being printed in highly imaginative newspaper accounts as proven fact. Inspector William Reid had come to South Australia in 1840 and joined the police as a constable, gradually rising through the ranks. By 1861 he was thinking of retirement and had considered moving to Port Macdonnell, then called McDonnell Bay, on the southeastern coast of South Australia. On the 7th of July 1861, after sunset, but still somewhat light at around 6 p.m, Reid was on the jetty, preparing to board a steamer called the Ant to return to Adelaide. While he was there, a truck laden with 30 bags of wheat, weighing about 3.5 tons, was being pushed along the jetty to be loaded onto the ship. The jetty had a downwards incline at the end, and the truck had no brakes, so that once it built up momentum, it kept moving. The men in charge of the truck saw Reid and called for him to look out, but he either did not hear them in time or couldn't find a way to escape other than to jump from the narrow jetty into the water. Pickering Lamb, who was on the truck, saw Reid move first one way and then the other, seeking to get out of the way just before he was struck. The truck hit Reid, knocking him down onto the rails, where it then passed over him, the weight causing internal injuries. Reid was picked up by the labourers moving the wheat and taken to Captain French's store. His brow was bathed with water and he was given a small sip of wine. Reid breathed heavily a few times when laid down, but within 5 minutes was dead. His body was examined the next day during the inquest. He had black bruises, one on the right side of his stomach and another on his back, but no other marks of violence. Without retiring, the jury returned a verdict of accidental death. The body of Inspector Reid was taken to Mount Gambier for burial on the 10th of June, 4 mounted troopers either side of the coffin, in a cortege of about 100 people, led by Reverend Reid of Geishan Bay, brother of the deceased. Reid was 44 when he died, and left a widow and 1 child. Albert Leslie Bowley probably suffered the most unusual death. Bowley was aged 34, and was 6 foot 2.5 inches tall, and considered to be the strongest man on the force at the time, and one of the most popular. He was captain of the police cricket club, an anchor for the police tug-of-war team. Constable Bowley was riding his bicycle along Paynham Road, St Peters, at about 4 p.m. on the 20th of January 1925. A canvas sunblind on the veranda outside the greengrocer shop at number 82, owned since December by Michael Anastas, was secured by a strap at one end and a length of string at the other. The string broke just as Bowley cycled past. The breeze caught the blind and it unfurled over the roadway, the wooden roller on the lower edge catching the policeman in the body. He fell to the roadway, doubled up in agony, having suffered a bruise on the lower left chest, and the force of the collision had ruptured blood vessels in his liver. He was operated on for his injuries, but died in hospital at 4 a.m. the following day. When struck, he had only been 200 yards from the police station, which was his destination. Bowley had been born and raised in Seven Hills, near Clare, in country South Australia. He worked as a blacksmith before joining the police in 1917. He left a widow, Ida, and 4 young children, all under the age of 10, Clifford, Keith, Jocelyn, and Robert. He had signed a mortgage not long before his death. A relief fund was set up to pay off the mortgage, with some left over for the children, which raised £773 by the time it closed in September. Bowley was buried at Paynham Cemetery on the 22nd of January, the funeral procession from his brother's house in Rosella Street, Paynham, being led by the police band. Llewellyn John Thomas was serving in Cyprus when he died in a vehicle accident on the 26th of July 1969, one of 3 Australian police to be killed on duty in Cyprus. The Mediterranean island is inhabited by Greeks and Turks. Ethnic tension flared in the 1950s, as both groups wanted Cyprus to become a part of their own countries. The United Kingdom had hegemony over the island from 1878 until granting independence in 1960. Arrangements under the new constitution for the country dissatisfied the majority Greek population, while Turks, who were only 18% of the population, feared that as a minority their rights would be pushed aside, and that Cyprus would seek political unity with Greece. Intercommunal violence was sparked when a Greek Cypriot policeman shot dead a Turkish Cypriot taxi driver who was resisting identification checks by police on his passengers in 1963. As a result of the violence in 1963 through 1964, 538 people died, 25,000 were displaced from their homes, and large-scale looting took place. Turkey was prevented from taking military action only by the establishment of a United Nations peacekeeping force to keep the two communities divided. Australia sent police officers to assist in maintaining the peace from May 1964 until June 2017. Police were originally recruited for the task from the state forces. Following the creation of the Australian Federal Police in 1979, they took over the duty exclusively. Thomas was from Port Augusta. Born 11th of April 1943, he joined the police in 1961, being appointed a probationary constable in 1963. He was promoted to first-class constable in 1968. Selected for the 6th contingent of police to be sent to Cyprus in 1969, he was sworn in as a special member of the Commonwealth Police, with the rank of sergeant. He was driving a police Land Rover on the 26th of July 1969, near a place called Mari, on the Limassol Road in the south of the country, when his vehicle went off the side of the road and down a 3-metre drop. He died as a result of the injuries he sustained. He was posthumously awarded the Police Overseas Service Medal, with Cyprus clasp, the United Nations Medal, and the Dag Hammarskjöld Medal. Thomas was the first Australian police officer to die on duty in Cyprus. 2 others lost their lives while serving on the island. Inspector Patrick Hackett from New South Wales also died in a traffic accident on the 29th of August 1971, while Sergeant Ian Ward, another New South Welshman, died when his vehicle drove over a landmine on the 12th of November 1974. Martin Henry Harnath, aged 49, was a diver who had been in the Underwater Recovery Squad since soon after its formation in 1957, from volunteers within the Traffic Police. He joined the police in February 1960 and was appointed diving director in 1967, and by 1985 was the officer in charge. In 1965 he had received mention for devotion to duty, and in 1969 and again in 1974 received special mentions for courage and ability. In 1969 he descended 230 feet into a mine shaft at Mount Granger to effect a rescue, and in 1974 took part in the recovery of 4 bodies from a sinkhole near Mount Gambier. The shaft was the name of a sinkhole beneath a dairy farm at Allendale East. A sinkhole is a limestone cave which was flooded with water, typical of the geology of the area. In February 1973, Harnath was part of a group of police officers who mapped and rated 30 different sinkholes, some of which had never been dived in before, for safety purposes. A group of 8 experienced divers from Sydney had gone down into the shaft on the 28th of May 1973, and 4 failed to surface. It was a certainty they had died, and at the time it was considered too dangerous to attempt to locate and recover the bodies of the 4. Stephen Millett, 22, his sister Christine Millett, 19, Gordon Roberts, 28, and John Bockerman, 20. As a result of their experiences in mapping the sinkholes, Harnath had noted that some of the equipment the squad was using was unsuitable for deep dives, and had requested new gear. By the following year the squad had been provided with their new equipment to help in such situations, and had received extra training from Australian Navy divers in deep diving techniques. In January 1974 a film crew came to the shaft, and when their powerful lights illuminated the cave, the body of Stephen Millett was found floating against the roof of the cave, about 50 feet down from the entrance. Harnath and another constable, named Tom Reinitz, recovered the body. The family who owned the land which the sinkhole underlay were uncomfortable knowing 3 more bodies were in the water, and asked a Victorian diving group to try and locate them. On the 9th of March they descended to 185 feet, and found the bodies within 20 feet of each other. The next day Harnath and others dived, but were unable to find the bodies before their activity stirred up enough silt to impair visibility. The following day another attempt was made, and Christine Millett and Gordon Roberts were located together and recovered. John Bockerman was deeper down and partially caught under a rock ledge. As the policemen attempting to tie a rope to the body felt the effects of the bends, or nitrogen narcosis, acting on them, they had to abandon the retrieval. Unable to tie a rope due to the effect of the bends on their brain function, they decided a clip that could be operated simply would be easier to manipulate down in the deep cold water, and that change in strategy enabled them to raise the body of Bockerman to the surface on the 9th of April 1974. On the 17th of September 1985, a new 7-metre $25,000 police launch was delivered to the Theberton barracks. The squad had been waiting for the boat for months. At 8:25 a.m. on the 18th of September, Harnath was doing some welding repairs on the aluminium boat in a shed, and while working on it, it exploded. Harnath was thrown from the boat, suffering head injuries and badly cut legs. The boat was left twisted by the force of the explosion, thought to have been caused by a fuel container catching fire. He was taken to hospital, where he was able to see his wife and 2 sons before entering surgery. His other child, a daughter, was not present. Despite the efforts of the medical staff, Harnath died at midday from the injuries he had sustained. His colleagues were stunned, as Harnath was known to be a stickler for safety. On the 20th of September, he was given a police funeral, the second in just 2 weeks. First Class Constable Lincoln Williams, having been shot and killed while on patrol on the 29th of August. A procession of police on motorcycle and the police band accompanying him to his final rest in the Rose Garden at Enfield Cemetery.